Hello and welcome to the Just and Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And as always, I want to give you all just a quick reminder that Just and Center as an organization is supported by donors. We do need your support. So if you have appreciated the things that we do and want to see the work that we do continue, please go to justincenter.org and go to our donate page, and you can help us out there. Now, today I'm going to be continuing our series, Makers of the Modern World. And as I've been doing this series, I really started with kind of Marxist thinkers, and then I really wanted to move into postmodernity in understanding the postmodern thinkers that have shaped our world today. But really, before I get into the subject of postmodernity, I really wanted to set some of the background in terms of structuralism, which I did in our Ferdinand de Saussure program, which is, at least as I'm recording this, it's by far our least viewed one, and I kind of get it because he is a figure that a lot of people don't know outside of the field of linguistics, and so it's not as enticing of a topic as looking at someone like Michel Foucault or Jacques Derrida, who I really want to get into. But those thinkers are post-structuralist thinkers. So postmodernists are often post-structuralists, particularly I'm thinking of Foucault and Derrida, but postmodernity has a number of other kind of figures coming from different perspectives, someone like a Richard Rorty, for example. But I don't think you can properly grasp or understand where the postmodernists are coming from and what they're responding to without getting an understanding of structuralism as a movement. So that's why instead of beginning with the Derrida Foucault, I began with Saussure and discussing the foundations of structuralism. So if you haven't watched that, I really would urge you to watch that before watching this one. I think things will make a lot more sense as you're looking at Roland Barthes. Unless you're already familiar with structuralism, then that's fine. But Bart is really the bridge between structuralism and then post-structuralism. So he's kind of the guy who is identified with really both movements in some way. So someone like Foucault or Derrida are both associated pretty much with post-structuralism, and Saussure is associated, and Strauss as well, are associated pretty much just with structuralism. But so Bart is kind of this mediating figure. And some of the main ideas that you find in Bart, particularly this notion of the death of the author, are going to be hugely influential for how people start to view texts in the Western world. And I would say this becomes really foundational for the complete shifting in terms of how the humanities are taught. And in some ways, the humanities, I don't think in a lot of our universities are really taught at all, but we'll get into that as we start looking at this. So I just want to set the groundwork there for why this particular figure is important. So when I'm saying Bart here, I'm not talking about Karl Barth, the theologian, Roland Barthes, both highly significant in 20th century thought. And I do actually want to do a video on Karl Barth as well, because I want to delve into some theologians in this series, but we're speaking Roland Barthes, not the same guy, no relation as far as I know. Their name's not even spelled the same way. Okay, so let's talk a little bit then about the life of Roland Barthes. He is born in Normandy, in Bayonne, France, in 1915. Bart's father died at a very young age, fighting in World War I. So Roland was an infant at this time. So he grew up essentially without a father. I'm sure you could do some kind of Freudian analysis about his lack of a father figure and how that shaped his thought, but I'm not going to do that. So he's raised by women. He is raised by his mother, his aunt, and his grandmother. So he is raised by women. He doesn't have a strong male role model in his life. Again, I'm sure that somehow plays out in his thought. But he moves to Paris at the age of 9. He goes to school in Paris, and then he ends up attending the Sorbonne. Now, the Sorbonne, if you're not familiar with it, is one of the most influential, significant universities really in the entirety of the Western world, and it has been since the medieval period. So the Sorbonne is a really significant school going back to the rise of, say, Renaissance humanism in the 15th and 16th century. He studies first classic literature, so he's got some writings on literature. He has a pretty long life, and so he has an extensive amount of topics that he talks about. So he's one of these figures that we can really kind of trace from delving into certain areas to then delving into different areas later in life, who's got kind of distinct periods in his intellectual life. So he first starts with literature, and we're going to see how he develops his ideas of literature from some of that background. But then he later studies topics like grammar, philology. So he's looking at words, how sentences work, how words work, how we understand things. And this is going to lead to his development of his approach to semiology or semiotics, signs, language. And so we see that in these two different areas of study, with literature and then grammar and philology, these are going to be the two major areas of influence where he's going to explore essentially how those things overlap. So Bart is going to explore how it is that our words and our grammar shape literature. And ultimately, he's going to say that, well, in some ways, words are arbitrary, and we'll talk about what that means. But the words themselves and the grammar and the language itself is the most important part of a literary piece. He's going to say, not the history, not the intentionality of the author, but the grammar and words themselves. So he receives his degree at the University of Paris in literature. He writes his thesis on Greek tragedy. So he's very well acquainted with the classics, but he's also going to be a major proponent of modernity in literature, particularly James Joyce. Okay, so some other details about his life before we get into his major ideas. He had a lot of health problems. He had tuberculosis when he was young. He was in a sanatorium for a while. He had these health problems throughout the entirety of his life. And so that seriously, I think, affects his work in many ways. It made teaching very difficult for him. He goes through a lot of really hard periods in his life. So in 1948, he begins working in the academy full-time. He writes in the 1950s on French culture because he is in France, to explore this idea of mythology, and we're going to explore what we mean by mythology. And he has a very broad understanding of mythology. He's not just here talking about like classical mythology, as you may assume with his doing work in Greek tragedies. He's not just talking about classic myths. He's talking more about what some Marxist thinkers are going to call ideology. There's probably more of an overlap between ideology and mythology in Bart. So he's talking about the basic ideas or myths that shape culture, and he starts to write a lot of essays on popular culture. So one of the most famous things that he writes about is wrestling. And so professional wrestling. We're not talking about like the actual sport of wrestling. So he takes professional wrestling and kind of creates this, or he's not creating a mythology, but he's explaining what the mythology, the ideas behind it are. So he's interested in kind of taking apart and exploring popular culture and the ideas that are put forth in popular culture. So by the mid-1960s, then, he's a recognized leader in the movement of structuralism and semiotics. So he's really the next most important figure following Saussure and Strauss. Is Roland Barthes. But again, what we see with Barthes is moving beyond the semiotics or structuralism of these other figures and more into something that is more akin to what we think of as postmodernity in some ways. And he certainly overlaps a lot with Derrida, and we're going to see that in his idea of the death of the author, there are certainly parallels with Derrida's deconstruction. And the two ideas really form one another and kind of cooperate together to form what is contemporary literary criticism. So he writes his very famous essay, The Death of the Author, in 1967, and we're going to explore that as we move on in this talk a little bit. He is hit by a van. It's a laundry van carrying laundry while he's crossing the street in 1980, and it kills him instantly. Actually, it didn't kill him instantly. No, he was in the hospital for about a week and eventually died. So that's wrong. He didn't die instantly, but he did die pretty unexpectedly from getting hit by a laundry van. But still, with that being the case, he still did have a relatively lengthy intellectual life. All right, Bart is influenced. So we're going to talk about some about his ideas now. So we're going to get into his metaphysics, his ideas of kind of first principles of philosophy, his ideas of being, of what reality is. He's influenced by Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, his Existentialism, and I'm going to be doing a separate program on Existentialism. So if you're watching this as I'm releasing it, it won't exist. But if you watch this in the playlist much later, there will be a Sartre video prior to this. So existentialism is a pretty complex movement. It's one of the most significant movements that really shapes the postmodernity in a lot of ways. Not that it is postmodernity, but it's very influential, first for postmodern thinkers in certain ways. So as I'm thinking about like kind of contemporary culture, and I think of the ideological movements that really shape where we are today, I tend to think about Marxism, existentialism, and postmodernity as kind of the three key. They're not the only ones, but they're three key movements that shape philosophically where people are coming from. So just to give you a very brief overview of where Sartre is coming from, existentialism is a broader movement. So someone like Kierkegaard and Sartre are going to be coming from very different perspectives. Martin Heidegger is sometimes considered an existentialist. He's certainly kind of in that sphere, but he doesn't consider himself one. And then you can go back to like a Christian writer like Dostoevsky, who's considered a kind of proto-existentialist. So it means all sorts of things for different figures. But when we're talking about Sartre, we're speaking about an existentialism that is explicitly a non-religious existentialism. And there are a number of Christian existentialists, Kierkegaard being kind of the foundational figure there, but not the only. There are a number of Roman Catholic existentialists, for example. And even someone like Karl Barth acknowledges some influence from existentialism, especially Kierkegaard, and he helped actually popularize Kierkegaard in Europe. So existentialism for Sartre is pretty much summarized by the very famous statement that existence precedes essence. And what he means by that in classical philosophy, the essence is what a thing is. And essence is not something that we can create. There is such a thing as a universal human essence, right? That I partake in. I can't change what a human essence is. It's an unchanging reality. I partake of that essence just by nature. I'm born as a human, and therefore I have a human essence, and I'm part of this universal thing that is humanity. But for Sartre, there is a shift from that kind of givenness of humanity, the givenness of the self, to one that the self is essentially self-chosen, right? So I decide who I want to be. I by the nature of how I choose to exist or express myself, that creates who I am. So I'm a kind of self-creative being. And we see this in his, for example, in Simone de Beauvoir, who is Sartre's lover, I guess. They weren't married, but and she takes some of these ideas to apply them to gender. And we're going to be exploring her thought in another video as well. But for Bart, just get that basic idea of existentialism to say that really helps to form him intellectually, and particularly this idea that there is no such thing as realism. So when I talk about realism, we're talking about classical realism, the ideas that you find in Plato and Aristotle. There are differences between Plato and Aristotle, but both of them are agreed that essences are real. So whether it's a human, whether it's a dog, whether it's a tree, whether it's something like triangularity, which tends to be Aquinas's kind of go-to, these are things that actually exist. And so there are these universal things, and then there are particular things that partake of the universals. So there is a universal reality of triangularity. There's a universal definition of what a triangle is. And as I look at various objects around the world, I might notice triangles. So I see kind of triangle shapes as I look out at my neighbor's house here, or if I'm playing The Legend of Zelda, I see, the Triforce, or you see this shape in different ways, and it fits the definition of triangularity. So you have the universal, which is the triangularity, and then you have the particulars, which are things that take part in what that universal is. So the individual particular triangles. And so what he's going to do is Bart is going to very strongly reject any idea of a realism. So he's a nominalist, as we explored in other videos. Nominalism meaning that those universals don't really exist. They're just kind of projections of the human mind. So we say that, well, triangles aren't really a thing. It's just that we identify things that appear similar to us in terms of our sense experience, and then we put the label triangle on them. So it's a human category. Now, what Bart is going to do is talk about this semiotics or signs and structures of society, that those are the things that we use to create the categories that we then impose on other objects. So the categories of reality are not things that are real. They're things that are societally constructed. So again, think about the gender issues. And I know I keep going back to that, but and the reason I keep going back to gender is just because I think that's the most obvious thing that we're facing in our culture today that demonstrates some of these underlying philosophical principles. So that, hey, gender is something that society has created. We have created these certain social expectations. There's not a gender essentialism or realism, where there is such a thing as a male or female. Essentially, we've just created these very social expectations. So therefore, if that's what defines a gender, then if I want to be a different gender, I just have to then fulfill those social expectations. Or what Judith Butler later is going to talk about is gender performativity. It's something that's performed in society. It's a series of actions and roles. And as long as I take those actions and roles and do those things, I am that gender, because there's no essence behind that of, say, a male or female. So that's going to be really key here. Now, there is no, for Barth, unifying human nature. And we've seen this over and over and over again, that starting with someone like Karl Marx, then the later 20th century, really, I think, is divided ideologically along this line. Do you believe that there is a universal human nature, or do you not? And the thinkers that form, progressivism, on one hand, tend to be those who reject a real universal of human nature, and those who are often classified as more conservative thinkers tend to believe that there is a universal or unified human nature. And that's going to have all sorts of implications about how you view various issues. But for Barth, there is no universal thing that is human nature. It's really just constructed. And he's going to say it's not just human nature, but there is really no nature as such at all. And so in some ways, we're going back to the problem that Kant faces of the thing in itself. And he's going to say there is no thing in itself, not that we have access to anyway. So there is just perception, and there is simply society and how we speak about things and how we understand things in relation to other things. So Barth rejects Hegel. We talked about, if you haven't watched the video on Hegel, Hegel has a philosophical system that emphasizes unity, and that there is a unity in all things, something objective, kind of understandable, that unites us, this Geist, or this world spirit, as he calls it. But he's going to say, no, there is no unity at all. There is just pure multiplicity. There are multiple objects, and that's it. So he rejects very strongly the kinds of ideas we see going back to the ancient Greeks, with someone like Heraclitus, who tries to say, well, all things are fire, or even back further, Thales, all things are water, or Parmenides, all things are the same. These ancient thinkers that try to find a ground for unity in the world, Barth is going to radically differ from that and say, no unity at all. All there are just individual objects. But here is where he then moves beyond what we've seen in some of these other thinkers. So we've already looked at plenty of thinkers that reject realism. Go back to the Middle Ages. We have the nominalists. Keep going back to this nominalism versus realism debate. And the reason I keep going back to it is because I think that really is the foundational issue in the modern world, particularly when we get the question of human nature. But the realism-nominalism debate, I think, is underneath that. And then where that really shows itself is in how this applies to the question of humanity or human nature as such. But Barth takes this anti-essentialism and then combines it with Marxism. Okay, so I know that many people have been critical of, say, someone like Jordan Peterson using the language of postmodern neo-Marxism. And they say there's no such thing as postmodern neo-Marxism, because Marxism and postmodernity are two totally different things. And they are. It's true. and in some ways, they're incompatible. But when you get to thinkers like Roland Barthes, we see that there are some things about postmodernity. Now, he's not generally considered quite a postmodernist, but he kind of is a parallel to that. And he takes ideas from Marxism and combines them. So among a lot of these thinkers, especially when we get to the individuals called the post-Marxists, we do see combining of some of the ideas of Marxism, some of the ideas of postmodernity. They kind of come together. So we see some of this in Barth here. Again, don't really categorize him as a postmodernist, but he has a lot of ideas that impact the postmodernists, and they're kind of on parallel places in some ideas. So this anti-essentialism combined with his Marxism now gets him to criticize realism from another perspective. So it's not just that he's saying that there's no metaphysical reality of these universals, but he then starts the criticism by saying, and if you are an essentialist, that's bourgeois. You're part of the bourgeoisie if you're a realist, an essentialist like a Plato or an Aristotle. And what he's going to say, he's going to add this political argument to all of this. Now to say that if you hold to an essentialist framework, if you're a classical realist, you are doing that to uphold bourgeois values, to tell everyone else the way that the bourgeois says things are has some kind of reality in the external world, beyond just what the bourgeois says. And so he's going to say, no, there's no reality of anything. So therefore, we can say that whatever the bourgeois says as universal doesn't mean anything because there is no universal. So it's then a political tactic to take down the bourgeois to say, well, they're not grabbing onto these universal principles. There are no universal principles. So who's to say they're right? And so it kind of justifies political revolution. So this is very, very important for seeing how a lot of our conversations have developed today. So when people talk about things like, heteronormativity, or kind of white normativity, or kind of the patriarchal system that has determined what general roles in society are, they're using the same tactic that shows up here in Bart, that Bart really promotes. He's not the only one who promotes this kind of idea, but he's one of the most significant voices who does this, to start to say that we can take apart the structures of society, and we can do that by saying there are no universals in society, and those structures of society that you have here and here are really just ideas that the upper class of the bourgeoisie has forced on everybody else and assumed them to be normative when they're really not. Okay, so I'm sure when you hear, rhetoric today, think about Bart, it really all fits very well. So he's going to say then, moving on, there are no objective and observable facts at all. Pretty bold claim there. There are only signs. And so he's going to take this semiotic approach of Saussure and say there's no reality behind the signs at all. Now, to be clear, you can be a structuralist realist, and there are some that are. So some of the insights that we see within the structuralist movement, and Saussure in particular, I think are very helpful because he really helps us, I think, to understand how ritual works, how we connect words with meaning. But you can take Saussure in a way to say that he's got a good analysis of some of these things, but there's an actual reality that those signs are pointing to. Saussure doesn't go that far because he's not even concerned with that, really. And Bart is very clear to say there's definitely nothing behind that. There's just the system of signs and words and sounds and actions, but there's nothing objective behind it. So all that exists is social systems and communication with one another. Okay, so semiology. Semiology, we talked about this, or semiotics. We're talking about the study of these signs. And if you remember in Saussure, we have two aspects of signs. There is the signifier and the signified. So the signifier is the word that we use. Say I use the word tree. The signified is the thing that I am referencing. So there is an actual thing that we identify as a tree. And when I say the word tree, you may have a mental image in your mind that pops up of what a tree is, or you may have just a linguistic definition in your head of what a tree is. But the point is, we use these linguistic signifiers to identify things in the real world. And going along with Saussure, Bart is going to accept this notion that the signs are, or that these signifiers are essentially arbitrary. So that there's nothing inherent within, say, the utterance tree in those particular sounds that are coming out of my mouth. There's no inherent connection with those sounds and the object itself. We have simply chosen to use that to identify the thing. So Bart is going to follow him and say, yes, these things are totally arbitrary. Now, along with this arbitrariness that you get from Saussure, then Bart is going to continue to politicize that, particularly to politicize it against the bourgeoisie. So he's going to say that, well, why is it some signs do seem normative to us, don't they? And I have, an example of this, which is, I have these dapper fellows here dressed up in white tie and black tie outfits here from different eras. And if you look at these, this is all throughout the 19th century, and we can look at this into the 20th century, and of course it changes because we have white tie, that's pretty much disappeared now. We have, black tie, the tuxedo is generally the most dressed up a man can be. But essentially, who's decided that these clothes that you see here are for, particularly formal events? Who has decided that, you can't wear cowboy boots and jeans and no shirt and show up to a really nice formal event? Why not? You could wear that if you feel like. I mean, it's all arbitrary. Culture is just a bunch of arbitrary decisions that these influential, probably abusive people force on everybody else. What he's going to say, what Bart's going to say, is these kind of expectations say that you have to have this kind of outfit to show up to a formal or important event. The upper classes make these decisions that this is the case, and then make everyone else feel as if that really is the case, that they really should and have to, say, wear these clothes to a formal event, to dress like they're someone important. And you could say this is oppressive because guess what? Tuxedos are pretty darn expensive if you're going to wear a tuxedo to an event. Now, I know people rent tuxedo. Don't rent a tuxedo. You can buy like a tuxedo that's as decent of a quality as one you can rent for like the same price. And the ones you rent are terrible quality. Anyway, buy one on eBay or something if you got to wear a tuxedo. And you could find a used decent tuxedo. Anyway, that's beside the point. But you could make a political analysis of this. Why have they said that the tuxedo is the thing that you need to wear to formal events? Well, you've done that because that makes it inaccessible for the lower classes, because the upper classes can afford them and the lower classes cannot. So therefore, it keeps the upper classes in power. It serves to support the bourgeoisie. So you see how you can have this kind of analysis of all sorts of signs. This is just one example. And Bart does this in various ways. I'm just using the tuxedo example, not that it necessarily comes from him. I don't know if he talks about this or not, but I know he talks about clothing to some extent. So he may, but not in anything that I've read at least. So these signs are just attempts at retaining power. And so the things that are valued as good, the things that are valued as right, the things that you eat, that you wear, how society works, these are just done for the purpose of retaining power. Then we get into this obsession with power in Bart that we have with someone like Foucault as well. It really comes from Marx, though Foucault and Marx do very different things with power, to be clear, because I know a lot of people kind of confuse the two, but they're very different. But in Nietzsche as well is another figure who's very different than Marx or Foucault. But there is this idea coming out of a lot of these 19th century thinkers throughout the 20th century that everything is essentially driven by power. Everything is power. Power is kind of the ultimate reality. It's the world exists in this just endless kind of fight for power in one way or another. We've got to get the right guys in power. And as long as we have the power, we can make things good. And certainly, I think you'd see that in the nature of our political discourses and just how everybody talks to each other. So these are just attempts at retaining power. So everything has this power analysis. When you're looking at a series of signs, when you're looking at how anything works, when you're analyzing movies or you're analyzing clothing or anything, you're looking at it with the question of power to define, well, how is this keeping the bourgeoisie in power? Or how is this used for, think today, how is this thing used to support white supremacy? I mean, that's kind of the way that people think about this today. And the fact is, you can find it wherever you look, because if you come to anything with a certain kind of predefined, this is what I'm going to find, you could find a way that anything is white supremacy. Not to say that there aren't actual things that could, that could be white supremacy, but when you're analyzing with that in mind of, I need to find this, of course you're going to find it, because you're interpreting everything through that lens. And that's what you find here with Bart. All right, so everything is about signs, not facts. So there isn't a question for Bart of facts. What's universal, what's true, what's real. So it's in this way that he very much is postmodern, in that he reacts against these universalizing principles that you find in modernity. And that's going to be really key for definitionally for what postmodernity is. So Bart is going to do that. So there aren't universal facts. There are just particular individual signs. That's it. So he's going to see that these kinds of structures that you can analyze in terms of power, that these exist throughout all sorts of cultural activities. So he's going to see it's the case in the food that you eat. For example, we could, as we look at these dapper men here, we could think about what are things that the bourgeois people do. They like caviar. I love caviar. But sorry, I'm a bit obnoxious and can be an elitist. So maybe this, is a valid criticism of me. But, if you're talking about like fancy foods, right? Caviar, you think of that as like something that's very, delicious, but it's totally inaccessible to the average person. What's something that's accessible to the average person? Well, let's say like corn, right? Corn's pretty cheap. We grow tons of corn. We make everything out of corn because it's cheap and easy to produce in large quantities. So why is it that we've decided that, caviar is better than corn? Well, because caviar is expensive and it's only the important wealthy people can afford it. Therefore, caviar is better than corn. And that's just an arbitrary thing. So you see how you can analyze food in this way too. Clothing, I talked about this, but clothing can be arbitrary. For example, I wear ties. I wear ties a lot. One of the things about the tie that's a little different from other pieces of clothing is the tie has no purpose at all. You wear a shirt because you want to cover your body and keep yourself warm, and pants, obviously, socks keep your feet a lot more comfortable. It's weird to wear shoes without socks. Glasses help you to see, but like a tie, it's useless. It's totally useless. It doesn't do anything. Just like this, pocket square that I've got on. This doesn't do anything. It just sits there. It's just purely decorative. And that's kind of what I like about it, because it's saying not everything is utilitarian. I wear a tie because I like it and I want to, and I want to show forth beauty because I think that the world is more than just utility. But he can look at something like the tie and say, well, that's just arbitrary. Who decided that like a tie is how you dress up? I mean, it's just like a random piece of cloth that hangs around your neck. Someone just decided that it was, which is kind of true, Someone just decided that that's what you do to dress up or to look more formal. And he has this famous essay where he explores professional wrestling in the structures that exist, or the ideas or realities that are displayed throughout professional wrestling. And I'm not going to get into the specifics there just because I'm looking at the amount of time that I have here and I can't do that. But if you think about wrestling, he's going to kind of compare this to activities that are seen as, say, really like important or, classically beautiful activities. Take opera. I love opera. Compare professional wrestling to opera. Well, actually, in reality, if you watch professional wrestling, and I watched it as a kid, I saw a steel cage match with Yokozuna, if anybody remembers him, from what was the WWF at the time before they got sued. And I haven't paid attention to wrestling in years, but you do have some of the same themes of like good and evil. And it is true that in like high culture and pop culture, I think you do have some of the same themes because those are the themes that I would say God implanted it within us because we are divinely created beings. But for Bart, that's just going to be arbitrary, something universal about those principles. But he's going to kind of say, why isn't professional wrestling as much of a serious art form as anything else? Maybe it should be. Maybe some of you will argue that it should be. And I know certain individuals who may be watching this who will say that. Okay, so... okay, so we move on from there to the next topic. Okay, so now we're going to, this is just brief overview, semiology, semiotics, what kinds of things are happening. Bart is going to talk about this in these semiological systems, and he's going to see something like, say professional wrestling. You could take that, but you could take the way that people understand food or dress or whatever, and you could say these are kind of all in some way self-contained systems. And so you have a semiological system. You can essentially take any of those systems and start to explore it and start to kind of peel apart what's going on in that system to say, how do these things relate to one another? Why is this person taking this action? What are the principles being displayed here? Who's really in power here? Which again is going to be a major theme. And so these systems include essentially three things that he's going to mention. There is ordering. There is distinction, and then there is classification. So ordering can be kind of a hierarchical ordering. He's going to see that hierarchical ordering is really not necessarily good, and he wants to kind of tear apart hierarchies in a lot of ways, as we see in some of the other things that he says. But so we order people in particular ways by the way that they dress. Say we determine that, and society doesn't do this that much actually anymore, nearly like it did. But if you think about, say, the Victorian age, and we're looking at the 19th century, think about the Gilded Age in the Americas, because the Gilded Age is a good example of total, class divisions in a pretty awful way. There's a lot of, abuses going on, and this is what leads to the rise of popularizing of things like socialism and Marxism, because there are these kind of genuine abuses that happen, which ultimately are, by law, addressed in many significant ways. But if you look at something like, that Gilded Age in the United States, you have I live right near John Rockefeller's childhood home. You can go visit it here. But you can see, there are those who have everything, who have this huge amount of the wealth, and then those who really, really have nothing. And that was, at that time, really displayed pretty clearly through the clothing that people wore. So you could take a pretty clear look at somebody and say, oh, because of what that person's wearing, I know that they're upper class. And you see somebody else and say, well, I know that they couldn't afford the more expensive things, so they have the less expensive things, so they're middle class. And then you look at somebody who's poor, and it's very obvious from what they're wearing. That's not as much the case anymore. Our system of maybe distinction materially in clothing is more like wearing disgusting looking designer stuff with giant logos all over the place. But even then, you could just buy fake junk from China that has the same logos, and who knows the difference anyway. So we don't maybe have it as much anymore, but that's an example of this system, right? A system where you have pieces of clothing, and those pieces of clothing play different roles and identify you in different ways, and you could do that with wealth. But you can do that in different ways. You can just do that as people's outfits say something about themselves. It's not necessarily bad. Like when I am doing any, clergy work, I have my clerical collar on. If I'm doing a church service, I have I'm usually wearing my alb and my chasuble. And when I'm in kind of lecture mode like this, teaching courses, I tend to dress like a professor, like I do when I do these lectures here that you're listening to. And so we do symbolize things in the way that we dress. And that could be, your doctors and police officers and people have different outfits. And we all do this to some extent. We all demonstrate something by the way that we dress. I wouldn't necessarily say that's a bad thing and it's all about power either, but this is how the more Marxist influenced semiologists are going to really look at it in terms of power. Distinction between people. So any system has distinction. And remember, if there is no broader unity, all there is distinction. So there is this thing as opposed to this thing. Or binary oppositions, as we'll say in Derrida, but so everything is defined by what it's not. And that's true in a lot of the things we've talked about so far, is things are not defined positively because there is no universal essence of what a thing is. They are just defined in opposition. So this is like Derrida's notion of différance, where you just kind of defer your definition of things to other things, and there is no real positive definition to anything. In classification, we want to classify things, so we use certain signifiers to identify certain signifieds. I mean, language wouldn't function if we didn't do that. So, there has to be a way to distinguish between a dog and a cat. Those two things identify something different. If we didn't have those classifications, and I just called everything a dog, then you couldn't have any meaningful conversations at all. Okay, so those are some of the elements of semiotics and the kind of analysis that he's going to be doing here. Now, we have to look then here at this notion of myth, because myth is one of the major themes that shows up here in Bart's work. And we've talked about his dissertation was in the era of in Greek tragedy. So he is very well read in classical mythology, but when he's using the term myth, he's speaking far beyond those classical myths. So he's not just saying the classical ideas that have shaped a given culture. And we tend to think of Greek myths, but like every culture has those myths. Like every culture in the world has various myths. I mean, India has its own myths. Africa has its own myths. Native Americans have their own myths. The Norse have their own myths. And some of these we know better than others, but there are mythological stories that are passed on through word and then written down from all over. That's part of how people share ideas, is through stories. But he's going to say it's not just these kind of ancient myths, but he's going to say pretty much everything that we do, every story that we have or create, every system of signs, every system of interaction that we have with somebody has these underlying ideas behind it that we are trying to promote through these stories or these systems. So just as you'd say, looking at, the Greek myths of, say, take a Greek myth, right? Take the story of Icarus. And Icarus is he's trapped with his father in this giant tower, and there's no way to escape, and so they decide they're going to make themselves these wings, and they make wings out of wax. Now Icarus is told, be careful about where you're flying. If you fly too low, the weight of the water is going to weigh you down. You're going to fall in the water. If you go too high, you're going to get too close to the sun, and the wax is going to melt. Right? And then Icarus, he's supposed to kind of take this middle ground between the two, and doesn't do it. He goes too high. His wings melt. He falls and crashes and dies. So there's a meaning behind that myth, right? The meaning is we are not gods, right? We are limited as humans. We're not one with just the animal life, so we can't go too low. There's something that distinguishes us, say, from the fish, but we're also not gods. Humanity occupies this place in between, and so that's a story of what happens when you think kind of too highly about yourself. And you think of Narcissus, and all of these myths have, I think, very clear kind of meanings, moral meanings, or other, not always moral, but meanings behind them. So, just like you see these ideas that are promoted by myths, Bart is going to kind of universalize. It's funny to say Bart universalizing because he doesn't like universalizing, but he's going to kind of universalize this idea of underlying principles, beliefs, morality that shows itself via story. And so Bart is going to see that through various social interactions and institutions. Often, though, the ideology, and pretty much always really, for Bart, is political. And you see this move in Bart where, then as you do really since Marx, is everything becomes increasingly political. Everything is viewed through a political lens. You can hardly make any comment today without someone calling it political, because we've politicized everything. And then we go on to say that you, as Christians, you shouldn't mix Christianity and politics, but then if everything is political, you just can't say anything because everybody's determined that everything's political. So these myths, these underlying ideas that we have, that we tell through our stories and our interactions in social systems, we teach these as if they are facts, but they are not. And again, he's going to say that this is pushed by the upper classes, or those who control the means of production. Not going to be talking about the upper classes that are progressives, which is a large portion of the upper classes, of course, but that's kind of a story for another time. And he's going to say all social systems really in some way are these bundles of contradictions. All social systems contradict one another. We act as if we have these universalizing principles. We have access to this universal truth. The bourgeois likes to push its own interests under the guise of universal truth. But Bart is going to say that's just not the case. In fact, every system is just a bunch of contradictions. So we shouldn't. The conclusion really is we shouldn't try to get to a universal truth at all, because it doesn't exist, and everybody just contradicts everybody else. So this is an example that he gives, is that within capitalism, because again he's Marxist in a lot of ways, so he's going to be critical of capitalism. That in a capitalist system, we talk a lot about equality, but he's going to say, well, capitalism is a contradictory system because we talk about equality, but capitalism actually ends up increasing inequality. Sounds nice until you actually look at Marxist governments and how much better capitalist ones are in terms of equality. But he's going to say that this is a bundle of kind of contradictions within this. So he's going to say every system is like that. He's not saying that it's just capitalism, but he says seemingly Marxism would be that way too in some way, because everything is contradiction. And so he would say that pretty much everything we do is myth, but he says there is some non-mythological language that we use, and that's political discourse. And he's going to say that political discourse is the most honest discourse we can have. Because for Bart, everything is political. And everything's about power. So everything you say is going to be politics anyway. Even if you don't seemingly think about politics, even if you're really just talking about anything else, underneath that is really politics. So the only way to have a real, honest conversation is to get rid of all the mythology stuff and get to the ideas underneath, which is politics, essentially capitalism versus Marxism. So the capitalist Marxist arguments are the most real conversations we can actually have. He doesn't mean by this that all myth is bad, because I think you can interpret it that way, that myth is bad, and Bart's not saying that. Bart will say myth is kind of necessary for any society to function, but we have to recognize what's myth and what's not. But here's where we see, I think, a very skewed perspective here. In terms of the favoring of kind of radical progressive politics, is he's going to say the least mythological discourse is a revolutionary discourse. And this, you see this in his writings, that ultimately it's pretty clear that leftist talk is reality, and conservative perspectives, as they're explained, that's just myth. So in some ways, he kind of tries to, again, this does also, I think, play in our culture today, but he does in some ways try to say that the only valid discourse is leftist discourse. And, well, once you've said that, what do you do to argue with that? Because you can't, because if you argue against that, then you're just engaging in mythology anyway. Okay, well, it's an easy way to win a debate, I guess, as long as everybody agrees on that, which, they don't. Okay, so here then is something else that is very often discussed and needs to be discussed, and we're talking about Bart, is Bart distinguishes between two different orders of semiological systems. And we could even go to a third, fourth order, whatever, but... So we have every sign that we have in our regular interactions, whether it's a linguistic sign or an action, we have one meaning that we attach to it. But systems, particularly, is going to talk about these kind of bourgeois systems, capitalism. What we can do then, bigger systems can take that sign, redefine it, and then make it part of a new system. And in doing that, the sign now is alienated from its actual meaning and alienates us from it. Okay, so let me give you an example to understand what I'm talking about. And these are the two examples that he gives. The first is, say, a rose or a bouquet of flowers or whatever. I mean, to find whatever flower you want. But, right, if I give a bouquet of flowers to my wife, it's a symbol of passion, right? Symbol of love. That I give her those flowers, and there's a very clear, definable meaning behind a man giving a woman flowers. And we understand that in our culture, or you give an engagement ring to a woman, that symbolizes your commitment to the other person, or a wedding ring symbolizes this is your commitment to somebody as you receive it. So we have these various symbols. But take a symbol of a rose, which should be, in its most basic sense, this meaningful exchange of, I give you this thing and I am expressing something about my care for you through this object being given. But then we see that capitalism, exploits the rose. So we create this, hallmark holiday of Valentine's Day, and then all of a sudden the flowers are really just a way to make money and a way to support these companies and businesses that want to sell you crap usually. So then the rose becomes no longer the system of passion. It's alienated from its original purpose. You see this kind of Marxist language of alienation, though it's a little different in the way that he applies it because it's in semiotics. But then it now becomes a symbol of capitalism. So now it's a symbol of just consumption and money and exchange, and it now loses that heart, the meaning behind it. The other example that he gives is what you see in this image, and this here is an image of a French soldier. Right, he's this young black boy who is dressed in this soldier's outfit, and you could say that this, by itself, it's an image of a soldier, and the symbolism behind the image of a soldier is that you are demonstrating loyalty to France, like loyalty to the government, that the kind of nationalistic fervor, something like that, patriotism toward your country when you see an image of a soldier like that. But Bart goes on to say, well, but look at this particular soldier and why they picked him, because he's clearly someone that is of African descent, and he's going to say that, well, France has actually been has done some pretty horrific things in Africa, particularly Algeria, in its kind of imperialistic actions in Algeria. And I'm no expert in French history at all. I'm not French, and someone else could tell the history much better than I could. But he goes on to say, well, so what is this image really representing? So like we have this first order semiological analysis that, okay, this is just representing patriotism or something. But underneath that, there is a more sinister message, he would say, which is that, well, look, French aren't that bad and haven't been that bad to the Africans, because look at this man of African descent who's giving his loyalty to France. So it's essentially really this political message that is pushed by the bourgeoisie to an abused or oppressed person. Okay, that's the argument that he's making. Now, I don't know anything about the story behind this particular image or who this kid is or anything, so I have no idea about the validity of his interpretation. All right. Now we are getting toward the end here. So there's a lot to cover on Bart, but we'll explore some of these ideas later as we get into Derrida and Foucault and some others. Okay, so there's a distinction that Bart makes between two different kinds of writers or authors. These are écrivains and écrivaines. And this helps us to see the kind of writing, because he is first a literary critic, and he studies literature first, then he gets into discussions of language. So here is where we see what kind of writing he privileges and what he sees as valuable and good in writing. Though, could it be universally so? Because nothing is universal. And this is the thing you find with Bart and a lot of people that are subjectivists in general, is a lot of their claims are claims about things that are seemingly universal. I mean, they do make seemingly universal kind of claims about what's good and what's not, even though they deny the universals altogether. I just don't know how consistently you can actually do that with and be able to say anything of any moral value whatsoever. So the écrivains are what he calls writers. And these people are really just engaged in myth. They're really using their stories for some other purpose. So usually this will be like, say, morality or politics, of course, or religion. In some ways, Bart's going to see all these things as kind of one, because everything's just politics and power anyway. And so these people, yeah, they write, interesting stories, but really there are ideas underneath what they're really writing, that what it really matters to them. So they're kind of hiding mythologically their real intentions. And this is just the classics. I mean, in some ways, this is his way to throw out like all classic literature. It's pretty radical. So he's like, oh yeah, Shakespeare, Jane Austen, Cervantes, like, the greatest writers that have existed in the European world. So some pretty bold things to say. So he's not going to say that they're of no value, but they're not superior. They're kind of hiding what they're doing underneath other things. So this second group then is who Bart privileges, and these are the écrivains. These are not writers; they are authors. They are more noble, so he uses the language of nobility. And these people are not so interested in this mythology, right? They're not so interested in hiding their ideas couched underneath various stories and systems and characters. Instead, they are interested in the words themselves, not in things. So again, there aren't really things anyway. They're particulars, but there aren't universal things. Or ideas. To be the best author, you gotta just focus on the words themselves. And he says these people don't just produce like novels, they produce texts. And for Bart, then, he says that in these people, it's really the signifiers that matter, not the signified. So it's not whatever is behind the words, it's just the words. So because remember, there's no meaning anyway that's objective or real. So in this, there is no kind of semiological realism. So like, why not? It's just the words as the words. Who cares? Just bang out some words on a page and there you go. Because the letters are the letters. So enjoy the words for what they are, not any meaning or purpose behind them at all. And he makes a statement that literature does not bear meaning at all. Okay. Which kind of is like the, entire history of literature. And I would say Western literature, but that's not true. I mean, that's just in general, that's how humans function. It's not just Western. But he's saying that, literature doesn't bear any meaning, but it critiques meaning. So the purpose of literature is to criticize, right? The purpose of literature is to critique the bourgeois, which again, how is that not ideology or mythology? Like, of course it is. But he's defined his terms in such a way to say that leftist ideas aren't ideology and right ideas are ideology. So therefore you can force whatever leftist ideas you want in your text and it's fine. It's bizarre. But so literature is really just to destroy, tear down. It doesn't have a constructive purpose at all. And this is what you see with a lot of postmodern art, which is that there is no, which is why I don't like postmodern art, because postmodern art tends to just destroy for the sake of destroying. It critiques, it questions, but it has no positive goal. There's no intention of creating a beautiful thing at the end at all. I wouldn't say that about all modern art, but about postmodern art, it's certainly true. So I have some examples here. His example is James Joyce. He loves Ulysses by James Joyce. I despise that book, and I don't say that about literature. I really do despise that book. I think it's a horrendous piece of work, and I think it's a bit, the emperor's wearing, the emperor's new clothes kind of situation here, where it's a kind of meaningless, ridiculous text that people have convinced themselves has value. So in order to appear as if you have, excessive literary understanding, you can set forth this completely meaningless, unexplainable text and say that you like it and understand it. I don't know that anybody really understands it. Yeah, it's got a lot of references to other literature, and yes, Joyce is smart, but I think that the text is not essentially meaningful in itself. But I probably really upset somebody there, but whatever. You can love Joyce. That's just, I have a harsh opinion about Joyce. And it's not because I don't like any modernity in writing. I love Kafka, but Joyce is something else. Anyway, he loves Joyce. Joyce just kind of plays with words. If you read Ulysses, especially you get toward the end. Yeah. Okay, then Flarf is another example of, this is a poetry movement. It's kind of like Dada. You could look at Dada as well. These poetry movements that are just kind of nonsense, purposeful nonsense. So there are nonsense poetry, nonsense art kind of movements. Absurdism, which are just playing with sounds, which doesn't really see meaning in itself. There's no meaning out there. There's just the sound. That's it. There's just the utterance. If that really is the case, then what does that say about Bart's books? Because he writes with intended meaning and trying to convince you of all sorts of things. And if he's really right, then his works are meaningless too. Okay, death of the author. This is the final topic we're going to talk about here. And this is something that we're going to pick up then as we get into the postmodernists. But we got to introduce it here because this is Bart's most famous essay. And these ideas you can already see in everything we've talked about already. But the death of the author. In this essay, The Death of the Author, Bart challenges, because you see how he has this focus on the text, the words themselves, not any external meaning. And so how that applies in a critique of literature is to say that, well, if that's the case, if it's the case that all that really matters is, the words themselves, no meaning behind it, then what does what the author intended by the words actually matter? Or does it matter? Because we do make this assumption that when someone writes a book, that when we want to understand that book, if the author's alive, right? I've written books, and I've had people tell me that my books mean things that I certainly didn't intend. So what do I do with that? Do I read a critique of my work that says something totally insane that was not at all what I intended in my book? And someone says that, am I allowed to defend myself and say that is not at all what those words mean? Or do I say, I don't know, the text is just a thing in itself. I can't help it. You can't blame me. It's just the text. But is generally you assume, like, of course, the author's intention matters in what they're writing. So you're going to generally assume that whatever the author says actually has something to do with how you interpret the text. And Bart is going to say, why? Why do we make that assumption? Why do I assume that if I read, Romeo and Juliet, that what Shakespeare meant by it matters? Why am I assuming that his interpretation of it is better than mine? Who says? It's just a text. Yeah, he's the guy who wrote it, but oh well. What? Remember, everything is arbitrary. So what's the necessary connection between the meaning of the author and the text? He's going to say there isn't one. The meaning of the author may have led to the text, but the text is an independent entity in and of itself. So I use this example in my book. If you don't have my book, by the way, Defense of the True, the Good, and the Beautiful, The Loss of Transcendence and the Decline of the West. I'm going to recommend this to you if you want to explore some of these issues more, which kind of gives an outline of a classical approach to these issues and critiques modernity. I do want to make this series into a book, by the way, because I think it would be worthwhile. But since I've already done I'm doing all the reading anyway, so I might as well. But the example that I use in that text is, say the beginning of Romeo and Juliet. There's I bite my thumb at you, sir. Do you bite your thumb at me? This whole exchange. And I bring this up because I remember my kids really like Shakespeare, especially my older son, and we were. He's 9. We got him when he was, a few years ago. We got him these like little kid versions of Shakespeare stories, and he's, kind of graduated from there to different. Now he's reading the versions that are just a little simplified language, but kind of line for line transliterations, and we'll get him to the real text, eventually. But I remember him asking me about this, like, what's this whole biting your thumb when he read Romeo and Juliet? Like, that's weird. So what does that mean? Well, it's a rude gesture at the time when Shakespeare's writing, but like no one in today's world is going to understand that. So the example I use is, well, what if a modern reader is like, well, why is he offended about biting his thumb? Well, maybe it's gross. Maybe he thinks that, there are germs on his hands and that he's going to get himself sick. Maybe that's the point of why he's offended by this. And, if I ask you, well, which of those meanings is correct? I mean, pretty much all of you are going to instinctively say, not the germs part, but the offensive gesture, because that was something that actually existed in Shakespeare's time. But according to Bart's understanding, that's not necessarily the case. So he sees this as, he refers to the death of the author here, so meaning the death of the intentionality of the author in terms of the text. He would call that the birth of the reader, so that the reader actually is as important to the text as the author itself, or even more important than the author. So now the reader has the freedom to see whatever they want in a text. So this is kind of how, out of this, you get feminist readings of classical texts and, queer readings of all sorts of texts, because you've gotten rid of the author's intention. That doesn't really matter at all in his perspective. So authorial intent is really irrelevant. Maybe it's an interesting historical question, but you can't let texts themselves be defined by ideologies or mythologies or history. And so this eventually leads to what's known as reader-oriented criticism, where you have, literary criticism that's really all about the reader, not about the text itself or the author. He is going to say the text itself is important. Everything ultimately is the text. I mean, that's Bart's kind of whole point. But the text divorced from any ideology, mythology, author, history, or anything else. And so I think the inevitable result is then it's whoever's reading the text. It really becomes just a pure subjectivist. I want to read this into the text so I can read whatever I want into the text. And, this is how you get, people reading the, relationship between David and Jonathan in the Bible and then concluding that they're homosexuals, and everyone in every Shakespeare play is homosexual, and whatever other kind of weird things you want to read in text, because, hey, nothing else really, matters other than what you decide to read out of the text. All right, so there's the end of Roland Barthes, and he's again, really, really important figure. I hope people do watch this one, because I know he's not a big name, but he's really influential, and I think you're missing a huge piece if you miss Barthes here. So we'll delve in the future into Derrida and Foucault. I think those are probably the two next ones I'm going to do, and from there I'll probably back up and do some talks on the existentialists. So, all right. Well, thanks so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do that here and on YouTube and on your podcast app. And we'll see you in the next one. God bless.